the Nakba, the destruction of Arab life in British Palestine and beyond. Part 2. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. If you missed part 1, find the link in the description. This is the Management of Reality, English edition, live podcast on July the 16th, 2026, says my calendar, and my calendar never lies. All right, so what are we doing today? Today we're doing part 2 of this article I'm going to put on the screen again to remind you where you can find it and what it looks like. So it's this article over here, okay? The Nakba, the destruction of Arab life in Mandatory Palestine and beyond. And I remind you that this is part 5 of a series called, let me show you. It's called The Arab Narrative, the War of 1948 and the Collapse of the Left. And what I aim to show here is, in the whole series, is that by adopting the Arab narrative in the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Western left, the political left, has self-annihilated. It has auto-destroyed itself. There's nothing left. Okay, that's what I'm aiming to show. All right, so in this part 5, we're talking about one key aspect of the Arab narrative, which says that the suffering of the Arabs that was caused by the War of 1948, which is Israel's War of Independence, that's the war that established the Jewish state, right? So the Arab narrative says that the Arab suffering that stems from that war is the fault of the Zionist Jews. Okay? And that's the narrative that the Western left has adopted. Okay, so now I'm going to remind you of the context that we covered in part 1 so that we can now finish examining all of this stuff and come to a conclusion. The context that we saw in part 1 is the following. In British Mandate Palestine, you had, as you did in Ottoman, in the Ottoman Levant, when that whole area was part of the Ottoman Empire, right? The kind of social structure that you had with the Arabs was a feudal structure. In other words, you had these lords, landowning lords who had gigantic landed estates, and they were, for the most part, absentee lords. They didn't even live in their estates. Somebody else did the work of administering them. And in these estates, there were large populations of Arab slaves. Okay, so the overwhelming majority of the population were Arab slaves. They were called fellahin, and they were debt slaves. In other words, they would be paid very, very little, so that they never had enough money to live. So they would, that was the structure of the system. So they would get loans from the lords that they could never repay because the interest rate was always ridiculous. And so because they were in chronic debt, they couldn't leave. So functionally, they were slaves. That was the social situation. And these Arab lords were quite oppressive. They were oppressive. All right. The Zionist Jews start coming in. Okay. This is first half of the 20th century. And they start making land purchases. As we cover in part 4, land purchases from Arab landowners who freely want to sell. Nobody was coerced. Okay. We cover all of that in part 4. And in these land purchases, what happens? Well, when the land changes hands, the Arab slaves go free. So the land purchases of the Zionist Jews were helping to liberate many Arab slaves. And those Arab slaves, once freed, would hire themselves out as laborers in the Jewish farms or in the Jewish industries that the arriving Zionist Jews were creating in British Mandate Palestine. Because the Zionist Jews in British Mandate Palestine produced a tremendous economic boom. Such an economic boom, in fact, that there was tremendous immigration from very different parts of the Arab world into British Mandate Palestine because lots of dirt poor Arabs looking for a better opportunity heard that the economy was booming in British Mandate Palestine. Okay, so in the same way that a lot of people try to get into Europe right now, a lot of Arabs, a lot of this was completely illegal, right? But a lot of Arabs were jumping over the fence to get into into British Mandate Palestine because the Zionist Jews made it flourish. Okay, so that was the situation. Now, there was an Arab quote unquote nationalist movement in opposition to the Zionist movement. But the other thing that we saw in part one is that this Arab quote unquote nationalist movement was in fact created and led by the aristocratic gangster bosses. Okay, the feudal lords, the landowning feudal lords of the area. So it wasn't really a nationalist movement. It was a criminal racket, and these lords, Haj Amin al-Husseini, chief among them, because he was the most important one. He is the founding father of what they call the Arab Palestinian movement, right? This Husseini, what he was doing is he was using the propaganda of hypernationalism, right? Oh, the Zionist Jews are bad and they are not from here and they want to steal our land and we're going to kill them. All that agitation, because that's what it was, all that agitation was being used by Husseini and his gangster buddies to intimidate the smallholders. In other words, people who had a little bit of land, but were not one of these lords who had these giant estates being worked by slaves. No, they were ordinary folk who had a little bit of land and were trying to farm it with very little success. So some of these smallholders, when they saw how much the Zionist Jews were paying for the land, because the Zionist Jews were paying an enormous amount for the land, right? So these smallholders wanted to sell. They wanted to capitalize themselves, get out of poverty by selling to the Jews. Great business opportunity for them. Husseini and his buddies would use the hyper-nationalist propaganda about the Jews are bad, they want to take our land from us, blah, 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 to intimidate the smallholders into not selling. So they would send their terrorist gunmen to visit the owners of these smaller plots of land. And they tell them, look, if you sell to the Jews, we're going to kill you and your entire family. And they would keep their word. So these people were terrorized. And then they would say to them, but if you want to sell to me, I'll buy your plot of land. Right? And then they chamber around and wait for your answer. Then they would consolidate many such plots of land into a larger estate, and these same gangsters would then sell it to the Jews for a tremendous profit. Okay, so it was just a criminal racket. What everybody calls the Arab Palestinian movement, it's just a criminal racket. It was born that way. And it was pummeling the Arabs, right? Not just the smallholders who were robbed of an opportunity to enrich themselves, but the Arab poor were also being trampled on, not only because most of them were slaves of these feudal lords, but also because in the agitation, in the anti-Jewish agitation, very violent, that Husseini and his cronies organized, because they were calculating, see, their idea was this: we get rich by selling land to the Jews. So we steal the land of the Arab smallholders, sell it to the Jews, make a lot of money, right? And it's even going to get better because we're going to get that land back when our racist anti-Jewish movement kicks these Zionists out. So we'll sell it to them right now, and then our terrorists are going to kick them out anyway, and we'll get the land back and their money, and we already have their money. Okay, that was Husseini's plan. But the violence against the Jews required that the Arab poor join the fight, right? The Arab, Husseini and his cronies, his gangster cronies, they needed the Arab poor to go out and kill Jews. The problem was that the Arab poor could see that the Zionist Jews coming to British Palestine were a benefit to them. That's the reason they had come. Most of these quote-unquote Arab Palestinians are the descendants of immigrants that came into British Palestine at the same time as the Zionist European Jews, okay? Both populations came in there at the same time. Most of them. There were a few Jews there already, and there were a few Arabs there already. But most of the people that we now call Israeli Jews and Arab Palestinians, most of them are descended from people who immigrated into the area at the same time. So the Arabs knew that the Zionist movement was good for the growth of the Arab community. A lot of them were emancipating themselves from slavery, so they didn't want to go out and kill Jews. Okay, and Husseini had to force them, and that's why he directed all that terrorism against them. Okay, we talked about that in part 1. So I remind you, the statistics for the so-called Arab revolt that goes from 1936 to 1939 are that Husseini killed over 400 Jews and several thousand Arabs. Okay, he was killing many, many, many more Arabs than Jews because the Arabs were tough to convince to go kill Jews. Now, this is the Arab Palestinian movement. Remember, it's a racist criminal racket that victimizes Jews and also Arabs. It is a terrible thing for the Arabs. And my claim in this particular installment is that the Nakba is a real thing. I mean, of course, there has been tremendous Arab suffering. I'm not going to deny that. There is a Nakba. But my argument is that the cause of the Nakba is these Arab gangsters. Okay? They are the ones to blame. The Zionist Jews were a blessing to the Arabs. Okay? A tremendous blessing. That's why so many of them immigrated into British Palestine. The curse on the Arabs is these jihadi gangsters, aristocratic gangsters, feudal landowners at the top. Okay? Husseini chief among them. Haj Amin al-Husseini was the main tormentor of these Arabs. He was the one killing all those thousands of Arabs in the Arab revolt that goes from 1936 to 1939. Okay? Now, let's get to our point. The question that we left hanging was then, who is more probably responsible for the suffering of the Arabs that stems from the war of 1948? The Zionist Jews who were blessing the Arabs, helping liberate them from slavery, producing an economic boom for them? Or these gangster bosses who were oppressing the Arabs and killing them by the thousands to force them to go kill Jews? Which side is more likely responsible for the suffering of the Arabs in the war of 1948? That's the question, right? And once you have the context that I just reviewed, the question answers itself. But I'm going to let the Arab bosses answer it anyway, because it'll be more eloquent like that. So this is what happened. The territory that was originally for a Jewish homeland, according to the League of Nations, which was called Palestine by the British, right? That's what became British Mandate Palestine. That territory, the League of Nations allowed the British to control after World War I, or let's say from 1920, okay? Because the British, in exchange, were committing themselves to assist the project of creating there a Jewish homeland. All right. That was the quid pro quo. The British Empire wanted to control that. The League of Nations said, okay, on condition that you help create a Jewish homeland in that territory. Now, the British, without consulting the League of Nations, 2 years later, in 1922, formalized the separation of 3/4 of that territory and gave it to the Arabs. So in 1922, 3/4 of the territory that had been promised for a Jewish homeland was separated to create an Arab Palestinian state called Transjordan, which became the Kingdom of Jordan. And then in 1947, which is right before the war of 1948, what happened was that the UN took Rump Palestine, the 1/4 that remained, and proposed to partition that into 2 states, another Arab Palestinian state and a Jewish state. So now what the UN was proposing is that fully 7/8 of the land originally promised for a Jewish homeland would go to the Arabs, and the Jews were going to get only 1/8 of the land originally promised to them. And the Zionist Jews said, okay, so long as we get something, we agree to let the Arabs get 7/8 of the land that was originally promised to us, to have 2 Arab Palestinian states. The Zionist Jews said, agreed. Now we're going to see what the Arabs said. You have to agree with me that in any market, you have to call this a good deal for the Arabs. They're getting 7/8 of the land that the League of Nations had promised to the Jews. In any market, that's a tremendously good deal for the Arabs. But the Arab bosses didn't want 2 states on land totaling 7/8 of what the Jews had been promised. This was not a question of getting enough in some absolute sense, nor was it a question of getting more than the Jews. The desire of the Arab bosses was for no Jewish state at all to exist. So the Arab bosses, never asking ordinary Arabs for their opinion, this is, of course, chiefly Husseini, they rejected out of hand the second Arab Palestinian state that the United Nations offered in 1947. This point should be landing hard. The free Palestine, quote unquote, that our Western leftist mobs keep chanting about, meaning a Judenrein Arab state, an Arab state cleansed of Jews, that's not a dream that the Jews have ever refused the Arabs. They were letting them have all 7/8 of Mandate Palestine for that. But the Arab bosses rejected that because it would have meant accepting the creation of a Jewish state. And no matter how small, their chief goal was for there no Jewish state to exist. Okay? And the Arab bosses decided to kill all the Jews. Now, this is not my interpretation of anything. This is what Arab boss Azam Pasha explained explicitly and publicly. Should the Zionist leadership accept the UN partition plan, he said in 1947, and I quote, "This will be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Tartar, that is to say the Mongol, massacres or the Crusader Wars." End of quote. Or perhaps Azam Pasha wanted to say but didn't dare, like Haj Amin al-Husseini's just concluded German Nazi final solution. Because I remind you, we discussed in part 1 that this Haj Amin al-Husseini, during the war, that's the founding father of the Arab Palestinian movement, during the war, he became a top Nazi. Hitler made him a top Nazi. and he had the highest responsibility in the German Nazi final solution. He was running the death camps right along with Adolf Eichmann. Okay. And Azam Pasha was a close friend of Haj Amin al-Husseini. So if you were wondering what kind of a guy is Azam Pasha, that he is threatening genocide against the Jews in 1947, 2 years after the German Nazi final solution was mercifully interrupted, well, the kind of guy he was a friend to the guy who had been directing the German Nazi final solution, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Okay, Azam Pasha and Husseini were friends and allies. Here they are, for example. Let me share my screen again. Here you can see them. I think this is at the Arab League. I think this is at the Arab League meeting in 1947 in Lebanon, which is where Azam Pasha made that threat. The threat that if the Jews accepted the UN's partition plan, that there would be a war of extermination. I think that that's a photo of that Arab League meeting. Okay, now I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because the next question I was going to ask was if Azam Pasha, when he threatened the Jews with genocide, was he speaking for the Arab bosses more generally? And he was, because he was the Secretary General of the Arab League, and he made that threat, as I just mentioned, from Lebanon at an Arab League meeting, at an Arab League summit that had been convened to discuss the question of the partition of Palestine, of British Palestine, right? So at that meeting was the editor of an important newspaper called Akhbar al-Yom. The editor's name was Mustafa Amin. And Mustafa Amin interviewed Azam Pasha about the intentions of the Arab bosses, and that's what he said. Okay. The interview in the newspaper was frankly and unashamedly titled, quote, "A War of Extermination," unquote. And it reads as follows. This translation is by historian Ephraim Karsh. I quote, "Abdul Rahman Azam Pasha spoke to me about the horrific war that was in the offing, saying," this is now Azam Pasha speaking, "I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war, as this will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres or the Crusader Wars. I believe that the number of volunteers from outside Palestine will be larger than Palestine's Arab population, for I know that volunteers will be arriving to us from as far as India, Afghanistan, and China to win the honor of martyrdom for the sake of Palestine. You might be surprised to learn that hundreds of Englishmen expressed their wish to volunteer in the Arab armies to fight the Jews. This war will be distinguished by 3 serious matters. First, faith, as each fighter deems his death on behalf of Palestine as the shortest road to paradise. Second, the war will be an opportunity for vast plunder. Third, it will be impossible to contain the zealous volunteers arriving from all corners of the world to avenge the martyrdom of the Palestine Arabs, and viewing the war as dignifying every Arab and every Muslim throughout the world." End of quote. When genocide, a war of extermination, is also a joyful, quote, "opportunity for vast plunder," unquote, and moreover the thing, quote, "dignifying every Arab and every Muslim throughout the world," unquote, what you've got is an orthodox Muslim jihad. Azam Pasha, as a friend of Haj Amin al-Husseini, felt no shame threatening the Jews with another genocide right after Husseini had finished his own. Such is the ideology and culture of Arab Muslim anti-Zionists. But the point here is that these bosses had no problem sacrificing the Arab residents of British Palestine if that was instrumental to killing the Jews. as revealed by Azam Pasha in his closing statement to Akbar al-Yom. And I quote, he, Azam Pasha, ended his conversation with me by saying, now this is Azam Pasha speaking, I foresee the consequences of this bloody war. I see before me its horrible battles. I can picture its dead, injured, and victims. But my conscience is clear, for we are not attacking, but defending ourselves. And we are not aggressors, but defenders against an aggression. End of quote. Azam Pasha was going to get many Arabs killed, but his conscience was clear. Yes, because he never cared about the Arabs. He only cared about killing Jews. If the Arabs of Palestine burned in the process, so be it. Arabs be damned. Anyway, what was Azam Pasha calling the quote-unquote aggression of the Zionist Jews? The Zionist Jewish leadership was accepting that 7/8 of the territory originally promised to them go to the Arabs. They would take just 1/8 to have a state of their own, however tiny, in land ancestral to them and continuously inhabited by them for thousands of years, where they might protect themselves. They needed a state because Azam Pasha's ally, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had been exterminating them in Europe just 2 years before. This Jewish desire, right after suffering genocide, to protect themselves from genocide, is the quote-unquote aggression that Azam Pasha and Haj Amin al-Husseini would answer with another attempted genocide. The Western left has adopted the Arab narrative of these monsters. How is this different from adopting Adolf Hitler himself? Now, let me pause for a second to remind you that if you want to read about the details of Haj Amin al-Husseini's crimes during World War II and his executive role in the German Nazi final solution, which a conspiracy of silence has kept from you, you can absolutely go read about that in Management of Reality. It's our most popular article right there. You're seeing it over here where my hand is. And if you click on that, you will read this article, which is called The Responsibility of the Arab-Palestinian Movement in the German Nazi Final Solution. We have all of the documentation for you. I have an entire book on this subject. If you're interested, it's in Spanish. But we also have a documentary and a bunch of other resources on the article for you to go explore. Okay? Now, as you might imagine, the question and answer sessions that we have after these podcasts are super interesting and super fun. And we learn together all kinds of interesting things. And we're building a theoretical community. We're learning how to investigate the geopolitical world and tossing hypotheses at each other and searching for evidence and building the model. And it's very exciting. And you're all invited to come. All you have to do is join as a Substack paid subscriber. So if you're already on Substack, all you have to do is upgrade to paid. If you're not, go to Substack, go to managementofreality.com or franciscogilwhite.com. You will see the links in the description, and then go to our articles. That's our Substack page, and you can join as a paid subscriber. And then you will have access to our Q&As. We're going to have another one right after I'm done with this podcast in another 30 minutes. Okay? So you have enough time to do it. You can do it while we finish with this one. All right, back to us. Now, where was I? I was right here. Okay. Now, I think the context is now very clear, right? Because Azam Pasha kept his word. Haj Amin al-Husseini kept his word. When the Zionist Jews accepted the UN partition plan, they launched the genocidal war of 1948. So if you threaten another people with genocide, for doing nothing more than trying to create a state of their own on 1/8 of the land that had been promised to them. If that's what you're calling a provocation, offensive enough that you're going to go exterminate an entire people, right? Then whatever happens to your own people in that war, that's your fault. I mean, you're a monster. You can't complain that something happened to your people in that war if what you tried to do was exterminate another people. Whatever happened to your people, that's your fault. You should have never started a genocidal war. That should be obvious. And that should have been obvious to all of the mobs that were out there chanting in favor of Gaza after October 7th. They had no business massacring those people. If you're going to go out and massacre people, and then your people get killed, well, it's your fault. What business did you have going out to massacre all those people? This is normal ethical thinking, people. And the leftists find it very difficult, which is another leg on my argument that the left has annihilated itself. They cannot think about ordinary ethical questions. All right. So, but now we have this context, right? Again, on this same point, you've got the Arab Muslim bosses threatening genocide, then keeping their word, launching a genocidal war of aggression, right? In this context, who do you predict is going to be most responsible for the suffering of the Arabs in this war? Again, the Zionist Jews who had been blessing them with economic growth and freeing them from slavery, or the Arab bosses who had been oppressing them and who had now launched a genocidal war of aggression. But I will deal with the accusations against the Jews anyway, because it's fun to show that it's just all lies. The heart of the accusation against the Zionist Jews for the war of 1948 is that allegedly the Zionist Jews had an ethnic cleansing campaign to get rid of the Arabs and get all of the land for themselves. This is what the leftists, the wide-eyed leftist children at our colleges in the West are hearing from their professors. That's what they tell them, okay? This is what the fight was like. I need to describe this. In addition to various irregular jihadi armies that recruited fighters from all over the world, the Israeli Jews were attacked by Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. I quote, "The invading forces were fully equipped with the standard weapons of a regular army of the time, artillery, tanks, armored cars, and personnel carriers, in addition to machine guns, mortars, and the usual small arms in great quantities, and full supplies of ammunition, oil, and gasoline. Further, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria had air forces. In contrast, the Jews had no matching artillery, no tanks, and no warplanes in the first days of the war." End of quote. Consistent with Azam Pasha's genocidal threat, the commission of war crimes became part and parcel of the Arab military doctrine in the War of 1948. The Arab armies routinely targeted Jewish civilians, and captured Israeli soldiers were tortured to death. This latter practice was so extreme and consistent that it became Israeli policy for soldiers trapped behind enemy lines without hope of rescue to blow themselves up with a grenade. The Israelis were clearly David fighting Goliath, but like David, they won. A miracle. Israelis call this the War of National Survival or the War of Independence because they survived an attempted genocide to establish their new Jewish state. Yet it was the Israelis who were accused of quote-unquote ethnic cleansing. War is peace, right? You're living in an Orwellian world where genocidal terrorists fly out of Gaza to torture to death 1,200 civilians and take 250 hostages back to Gaza. and it is Israel that is accused of genocide, right? Same thing. Azam Pasha threatens genocide, and then Husseini and Azam Pasha try to keep their word and launch the genocidal war of aggression with the support of all of those Arab states. And it is the Zionist Jews who are accused of ethnic cleansing. It's always been like this, okay? What's been happening the last 3 years is nothing new. What our children, because they are children, forgive me, they're not adults. What our children at our Western colleges are hearing from their professors, their Marxist professors, and they're all Marxists in the social sciences. They're all Marxists. What they're hearing is what Edward Said told them to say. Okay, Edward Said, the Arab intellectual, the English literature professor at Columbia University. Okay, the quote unquote Palestinian. He was not a Palestinian. He was Egyptian. But he was a card-carrying member of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He was a member of that terrorist group, okay? And he said, and I quote, and this is what the undergrads were told, okay? Because Said became required reading. This is what he said, quote, yes, the Jews suffered the Holocaust, and yes, they are the victims of anti-Semitism. But no, they cannot use those facts to continue or initiate the dispossession of another people that bears no responsibility for either of those prior facts. End of quote. In this manner, Edward Said, card-carrying member of PLO Fatah, the terror group created by Haj Amin al-Husseini, butcher of the European Jews, brazenly denied the supreme responsibility of the Arab-Palestinian movement in the Holocaust. That's the guy who gave all of these Western leftist mobs their model of the world. He was just a liar. He was a member of the terrorist PLO Fatah, created by Husseini, the exterminator of the European Jews and founding father of the Arab-Palestinian movement. And this guy told everybody in the West that the Arab-Palestinian movement supposedly had no responsibility in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. When the truth is that the Arab-Palestinian movement collaborated with the German Nazi movement to exterminate the European Jews. That's what happened. And then Husseini, the founding father of that movement in the post-war, created PLO Fatah, the organization. Well, it created Fatah, which later ate up the PLO. And that's the organization that Edward Said belonged to. Just lying to us, just making stuff up to cover up for the PLO. And notice, Said is accusing the Israeli Jews of ethnic cleansing. And this is what they call the Nakba. So, affecting even-handedness, Edward Said says, quote, ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing whether it is done by Zionists or Hamas, end of quote. How to answer this accusation? Well, I think giving people the entire context of how the war happened and what it meant to the Arabs and so forth, I think that's important. We've already done that. But with that work done, when people say that the Zionist Jews were supposedly cleansing the Arabs in the war of 1948, I don't think the first thing anybody should do is to rush heatedly to deny the accusation of ethnic cleansing. I don't think that's the right move. I'm going to tell you why. Because I think it is more important first to stand on principle. Okay? So before you deny the accusation, if you're defending the Jews, first ask the person making the accusation, hey, should you be morally required to welcome, protect, and absorb those who've come to murder you and all of your people? I'm asking you, whoever you are, Process this question in the first person. Think of yourself. Think of your own people. They're coming to kill you and everybody else in your people. Should you be morally required to welcome, protect, and absorb those people who are coming to murder all of your nation? Once you ask the question in the first person, your answer will be no. Of course not. And what's good for the goose, you, is good for the Jews. The moral point is very simple. If the Jews had expelled those who came to exterminate them, they would have been perfectly justified. The verb I used is expel. Don't twist my words. And I said perfectly justified. I mean that. No people can be expected to tolerate enemies who mean to exterminate them. Therefore, Edward Said's pretend quote-unquote moral lesson is wrong. It is false that ethnic cleansing, quote, ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing whether it is done by Zionists or Hamas, end of quote. If you launch a war of genocidal aggression, as Husseini did, as Hamas has done, then your ethnic cleansing is perfectly immoral. You're a genocidal criminal. By contrast, if you are suffering a genocidal attack and you ethnically cleanse, expel, to make yourself safe from the genocidal aggressor, then you are perfectly justified. But I would make an even stronger point. The Jews should have expelled their genocidal Arab neighbors. This is ethically self-evident and strategically required. It was therefore a security and moral failure that they didn't. And October 7th is the proof. But anyway, what are the facts in the war of 1948? The ethnic cleansing charge against the Jews almost always reduces to one claim: the supposedly deliberate massacre and rape of Arab civilians in the Arab town of Deir Yassin. According to this oft-repeated story, heard in the halls of woke leftist Western academia, this alleged crime scared many Arabs into leaving, and this became the quote-unquote Palestinian refugee problem. The allegation, however, evaporates upon inspection. When you trace it, it turns out that it goes back to a certain Hussein Khalidi. As Palestine Facts explained, quote, Khalidi was one of the originators of the quote-unquote massacre allegation in 1948. It was Khalidi's claims about Jewish atrocities in Deir Yassin that were the basis for an article in the New York Times by its correspondent, Dana Schmidt, claiming a massacre took place. The Times article has been widely reprinted and cited as proof of the massacre throughout the past 50 years. Forgive me. End of quote. So did Palestine Facts get this right? Yes, they did. I went for that article and I found it. I found the New York Times article that Dana Schmidt wrote in 1948. And it says the following, quote, Dr. Hussein Khalidi, secretary of the Palestine Arab Higher Committee, denounced the massacre of 250 Arab men, women, and children by Irgun Tzvai Leumi and the Stern Gang, Zionist terrorist groups at Deir Yassin on Friday, end of quote. Now, lots of people believe the New York Times is a responsible publication, and they also somehow find it natural that Jews would massacre Arabs. So they've been assuming, as Palestine Facts pointed out, that if Dana Schmidt of the New York Times reports a claim on the authority of Hussein Khalidi, that's because Hussein Khalidi can be trusted. But let us ask, who was Hussein Khalidi? Khalidi was the, quote, secretary of the Palestine Arab Higher Committee, end of quote. And what was the Arab Higher Committee? Oh, well, that was Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini's vehicle to mobilize Arab hooligans to kill Jews in Mandate Palestine. Thus, when Khalidi claimed that the Jews had massacred Arabs in Deir Yassin, this was Husseini speaking. Mind you, this was Husseini speaking even as British parliamentarians in the House of Commons had been angrily demanding that Husseini be tried in the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role leading the German Nazi final solution and other outrages. Husseini and his Nazi crimes were world famous back then. We have then that Dana Schmidt of the New York Times accepted as reliable an accusation against the Jews by their Nazi exterminator, who was now playing the victim even as he led the Arabs in the War of 1948 to attempt another anti-Jewish genocide. Once this context sinks in, it can no longer surprise you that Dana Schmidt of the New York Times called the, quote, Irgun Zwei Leumi and the Stern Gang, unquote, the defenders of the Jews, terrorists, quote unquote. This has been a consistent move by the reality managing establishment throughout the post-war. Killings of Jews, even torturing to death more than 1,000 civilians and abducting some 250 others, October 7th, is called resistance. Jewish self-defense, despite a purity of arms doctrine that hands all kinds of advantages to the enemy, is called terrorism and genocide. Neither can it surprise you that the New York Times and the rest of the mainstream mass media have accepted without blushing anything that the Hamas genocidal terrorists say about recent casualties in Gaza. After all, the New York Times accepted claims of an alleged massacre of Arabs from Haj Amin al-Husseini, exterminator of the European Jews. Today, such nonsense is made, quote unquote, reasonable to the half-comatose leftist mobs on the principle, quote unquote, that whoever has the smallest gun, the quote unquote little guy, is supposedly the good guy, and therefore the little guy must always be believed. Hence, the little guy may perform with impunity any evil. I have seen people with university degrees express this view. An older, abhorrent, and illegitimate principle, might makes right, is thus substituted by this equally abhorrent moral atrocity. Weak makes right. But if this matters to you, this is worse than morally abhorrent nonsense. For ordinary folk, this is strategic absurdity, and it will get those who defend it killed. I'm not going to get into it right now, but in the article, I have a whole footnote to explain that point. I have one more witness, Hassem Nusseibeh, because this guy is the smoking gun. Accusations against the Jews on their conduct of the war of 1948 coming from Haj Amin al-Husseini, their exterminator, do not survive the most elementary smell test and should be dismissed out of hand and out of principle. But if anybody insists on the production of a smoking gun, we got it. Some years ago, quote, the 1988 BBC TV series, Israel and the Arabs, the 50-year conflict, documented that Arab Higher Committee officials Hassem Nusseibeh and Hussein Khalidi falsified facts about Deir Yassin and originated, for propaganda purposes, charges of rape, end of quote. And how did the BBC document this? Nusseibeh confessed. And you can see that for yourself, because in the article, we have embedded the link to the YouTube video where you can see Nusseibeh's confession to the BBC. Naturally, the BBC subsequently buried this. They obviously were not expecting Hassem Nusseibeh to ruin the Nakba story that the BBC has itself been pushing. Joseph Farah, an Arab investigative journalist, Christian, provided an important supporting context for Nusseibeh's confession. He documented with Arab newspaper articles written close to the time of the events that back then there was no ambiguity on this point, not among the Arabs. It turns out, and I quote one of the newspapers that Farah put together, I quote, the 15th May 1948 arrived. On that day, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, appealed to the Arabs of Palestine to leave the country because the Arab armies were about to enter and fight in their stead, end of quote. The Arab newspapers lamented this as a tactical mistake. I quote, this is another newspaper, quote, by spreading rumors of Jewish atrocities, killings of women and children, etc., Arab leaders instilled fear and terror in the hearts of the Arabs in Palestine until they fled, leaving their homes and properties to the enemy, end of quote. Both of the above quotes come from the Arab newspapers that Farah cites, and there are others. I give you the link to his article. Finally, there was never anything to substantiate the charges of rape. Quote, contrary to claims from Arab propagandists at the time and some since, no evidence has ever been produced that any women were raped. On the contrary, every villager ever interviewed has denied these allegations. These are Arab villagers. Like many of the claims, this was a deliberate propaganda ploy, but one that backfired. Khazam Nusseibeh, who worked for Haj Amin al-Husseini's Palestine Broadcasting Service in 1948, admitted being told by Hussein Khalidi, a Palestinian Arab leader, to fabricate the atrocity claims. Abu Mahmoud, a Deir Yassin resident in 1948, told Khalidi, quote, there was no rape, unquote, but Khalidi replied, quote, we have to say this so the Arab armies will come to liberate Palestine from the Jews, end of quote. Nusseibeh told the BBC 50 years later, quote, this was our biggest mistake. We did not realize how our people would react. As soon as they heard that women had been raped at Deir Yassin, Palestinians fled in terror, end of quote. Deir Yassin is supposed to be the best item in the Arab narrative accusation that the Zionist Jews supposedly had an ethnic cleansing policy in the war of 1948. Okay? When they tell you that the Zionist Jews had an ethnic cleansing policy, it always comes back down to Deir Yassin. Because Deir Yassin is supposedly what scared all those Arabs into leaving. And it turns out that the charges of massacre and rape and so forth were propaganda lies launched by the exterminator of the European Jews, Haj Amin al-Hussein. So who's to blame for the Nakba? Haj Amin al-Husseini. Now, were it not for anti-Semitism, the above demonstration, what we've just been through, would be entirely superfluous. First of all, because as mentioned earlier, the Jews need not apologize for expelling those who meant to exterminate them. If they had done it, that would have been the right thing to do. Second, because within the Green Line, that is to say, the portion of Israel that does not include the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria and Gaza, the Arabs are fully 20% of the population, and they are supremely well protected by Israeli law and custom. They may skip military service entirely if they want to. Jews may not. They can run for local office. They have representation in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. Arab jurists sit in the Israeli Supreme Court. Israeli universities have an affirmative action policy favoring Arabs, etc. Everybody should want to be, quote unquote, cleansed by the Jews. It is the Arabs whom Israel does not govern, enslaved by the terrorist power of their Arab bosses in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, who have been destroyed. That's because Haj Amin al-Husseini's legacy lives on via PLO Fatah. PLO Fatah is continuing today the Husseini tradition, just like Hamas is too. They're continuing the Husseini tradition of grinding the Arabs to kill the Jews. Okay? The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was created by Egyptian dictator Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1964 as a confederation of Palestinian, quote-unquote, terrorist groups dedicated to murder Jews, preferably, but not exclusively, in Israel. By 1970, Al-Fatah, a different terrorist group, had swallowed the PLO, keeping its name. I quote historian Howard Sakhar, quote, the PLO in its resurrected form was almost entirely Fatah-dominated, and Fatah boss Yasser Arafat himself served as president of its executive, end of quote. That's why I always say PLO Fatah. Understanding that PLO Fatah, the PLO in its resurrected form, is basically just Fatah is very important because, quote, the Fatah, or Arab Liberation Movement, was organized by veterans of the Mufti's Haj Amin al-Husseini former Arab Higher Committee, end of quote. PLO Fatah, what we now call the Palestinian Authority, which is in the hills of Judea and Samaria, pretending to be a government over the Arabs, is a creation of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the butcher, the Nazi butcher of the European Jews. That's what happened here. That's what the Oslo process did. You can't shake this guy Husseini. We're still fighting Husseini. Now, this guy Husseini, exterminator of the European Jews, whose dearest dream had been to exterminate them in Israel, was either a great uncle of Yasser Arafat or, out of affection, he just pretended to be. On this point, historians don't agree. But those two were quite fond of each other. There's no controversy on that point. Expressions of love, as any anthropologist will tell you, must be interpreted within the local grammar and value system of the participants. What does a loving Nazi uncle want for his favorite nephew? Nazi training. And Husseini could procure this because he'd taken refuge in Cairo after the war, where Arafat also was, and where many German Nazi colleagues of Husseini arrived in the post-war to, quote-unquote, improve Nasser's security forces. Thus it was that Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and a few other eager Nazi trainees became, in the late 1950s, the founders of Fatah. Before he died, and right as Fatah was swallowing the PLO, Husseini made sure to pass the leadership baton to his beloved Yasser Arafat and entrusted to him the sacred mission, the genocidal destruction of Israel. The dramatic exchange was documented by historians Barry Rubin and Wolfgang Schwanitz a few years ago with material they found in the archives of Lebanese intelligence. And I quote, "On December 29, 1968, at a meeting in the ex-Grand Mufti's home near Beirut, al-Husseini anointed Arafat his successor. The movement would be directed by these two sequential leaders and their similar philosophy and methods for an astounding 83 years, from al-Husseini's becoming Grand Mufti in 1921 to Arafat's death in 2004. In December 1968, the 39-year-old Arafat, leader of the Fatah guerrilla group, was about to take over a PLO hitherto dominated by the Nazi collaborator Abd an-Nasser. But Arafat's success would be all the more secure if he received the 71-year-old al-Husseini's endorsement. Al-Husseini gave it after lecturing Arafat for several hours on how he should go about destroying Israel and replacing it with a Palestinian Arab state. Within a few weeks, Arafat controlled the movement as thoroughly as al-Husseini had ever done." End of quote. Yasser Arafat, PLO Fatah boss, was the anointed successor of the exterminator of the European Jews. And he was anointed to go finish the job in Israel. And that's what the Oslo process brought into Judea and Samaria. Now, an account of how PLO Fatah, or what we call the Palestinian Authority, has destroyed the lives of Arabs in those territories requires a separate piece. That's coming soon. The point here is that, as you should expect from the fact that this is Husseini's creation to continue his genocidal legacy, PLO Fatah has continued and deepened the real Nakba. They're still at it. They've been grinding the Arabs to kill the Jews, and they've destroyed the Arabs. And not just the Arabs. They've been grinding the Persians too, because PLO Fatah, as we have documented for you, are the creators of jihadi Iran. And that you may read. I'm almost done, but I'm going to put that on the screen because that's very important, and you should go check this documentation as well. So over here, you have, no, that's not it. Forgive me. That's not it. I meant this article over here. War is peace. Did the U.S. force Israel to cede strategic territory to Iran? And what we document here is how PLO Fatah created Iranian jihadism. Look at them. That's Ayatollah Khomeini. Oops. Sorry about that. I can never get this right. There we go. That's Ayatollah Khomeini with Yasser Arafat in Tehran immediately after Khomeini took power. Why was Arafat celebrating with Khomeini? Because Arafat and PLO Fatah had trained and armed Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in the 1970s. And then Arafat helped Ayatollah Khomeini set up the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the creator of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Okay, PLO Fatah produced all of this. And why did PLO Fatah produce Jihadi Iran? Because Jihadi Iran is the tool to complete the genocide here in Israel. The final solution that Husseini couldn't finish in World War II will now be finished by the pincer movement that PLO Fatah has created, getting inside of Israel with the Oslo process and encircling Israel with the Iranian axis. Okay? That's what's been going on. With the help of whom? Of the US presidents, of course. Okay? So go read this article too so that you can understand the entire context. Okay, now to close. The Israeli bosses are not blameless. Let me be very clear about this. The Israeli bosses, obeying always the US presidents, have protected neither Jews nor Arabs. By participating in the so-called Oslo peace process that the US presidents invented, they collaborated in bringing the anti-Semitic terrorists of PLO Fatah to govern the Arabs in the disputed territories. And in all these years, they have not expelled PLO Fatah from Israel. The Israeli bosses are therefore co-responsible for countless murders of Jews and for the utter destruction of the Arabs. I have made this case at length in a talk that I gave at the University of California in San Diego a couple of years ago. I put the video. The video is embedded in the article. You can go look at it. Now, I claim that this is a dramatic fact. Okay, and by dramatic fact, I mean a diagnostic fact. In other words, a fact that the hypothesis under consideration requires to be impossible. But since it's documented, we know the hypothesis is false. Okay? Now, which hypothesis does this fact refute? Well, this is the fact. The Free Palestine crowds never complained that the Israeli bosses imposed PLO Fatah on the Arabs resident in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. They never complain about this. Which hypothesis requires the Free Palestine crowds never to complain about this? Or rather, which hypothesis, forgive me, which hypothesis requires the fact that the Free Palestine crowds never complain about this to be impossible? Okay? Which hypothesis says, well, that should be impossible? Well, that's the hypothesis that says that the Free Palestine mobs care about the Arabs. Their chief complaint, what they scream in the streets, is that Israel is supposedly oppressing the Arabs, right? That the Israeli bosses are supposedly oppressing the Arabs. Well, you couldn't have a better complaint against the Israeli bosses than the fact that they collaborated with the Oslo process to turn these murderous terrorists into their government, the government of the Arabs, to destroy the Arabs. That's the best complaint you can have against the Israeli bosses. But they never make this complaint, because if they did make this complaint, that would create political pressure for the Israeli government to get rid of PLO Fatah, to expel them from Judea and Samaria. Why? Because you want to protect the Arabs. But see, that's not what the Western left is really trying to protect. They're trying to protect PLO Fatah, the murderer of the Arabs, the oppressor of the Arabs. So what they really care about is killing Jews, because that's what PLO Fatah is a specialist for. It's for grinding the Arabs to kill the Jews. Okay? We cannot allege the ignorance of the leaders of this process, of the meaning makers who control what is said in the media and in the universities. Those people know what they're doing. Okay? Those people know that PLO Fatah has destroyed the Arabs. And so the fact that they've been protecting the Oslo process and the prestige of the PLO, and that they never complained that the Israeli government put the PLO over the Arabs, they never complained about that. That's fine with them, because they want the PLO there in militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state, so that they will be in a good position to exterminate the Israeli Jews. That's what's going on. And it's obvious. If you stop listening to what people say they're doing and you just focus on the material facts on the ground, it's obvious. So, what is the Western left? The Western left is the Nazi right. They are protecting the continuation of the final solution in Judea and Samaria. The left, the woke left, is the Nazi right. Matter meets antimatter. The left has annihilated itself. There is nothing left. If you want to understand how this happened, read some more articles in our Substack, in Management of Reality. They are designed as a web of articles where each one takes you to other articles. And this is the challenge. I think this works. If you read between 5 and 7 articles, it doesn't matter which. So start anywhere, read an article, and that will generate questions. And the article itself will tell you in which other pieces you can find the answers to those questions. And everything is documented. And if you follow a chain of 5 to 7, 8 articles, maybe, is my guess. Let's find out. Try it. I claim that will be enough for you to kind of produce the whole model that we're selling by intuition. You'll just fill in the blanks. And then the rest of your experience, as you keep reading in the website, it'll be a confirmation of the model you already built with the initial seed articles. Okay? I'm almost sure this is going to happen. So it's not that big of an investment. Go read 5 to 7 articles, and I claim that will make the model that we are teaching emerge in your head, and you will begin understanding everything that is happening in world geopolitics. Okay? And you'll be able to start making predictions about what the players are going to do, or at least try to do, which is all you can really predict. You can predict what they'll try to do. You can't predict if they're going to necessarily succeed, right? Okay, so that's a wrap. Those of you who are paid subscribers on Substack, I'll see you in a second in the Q&A. And all of you, please remember to subscribe and like and share. Very important to share, because only by sharing this information and making everybody aware in the West can we really defend Western civilization. And we all have to, we all have to do our part. Everybody has to do a little more than a grain of sand. A grain of sand is not enough, and we all have to pitch in. So get going and give me all your money.